Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 283, Henri and Catherine. Henri, Duke of Orleans, was born on March the 31st, 1519. He was the second son of a king we've discussed already, Francis I. Henry's childhood was traumatic, to say the least. He lost his mother when he was only 5. Not long afterwards, Henry and his brother became the innocent victims of his father's worst political and military disaster, the Battle of Pavia in 1525. But before we move on to Francis's death and Henry's ascension, we need to review some of the events of Francis's reign from Henry's perspective to understand how these traumatic years impacted his development later on. So once more, before we go forward, we must briefly go back. Back in 1515, when Francis I became king, the young man immediately devoted his energies toward martial pursuits. He claimed, and won, the city of Milan from its ancestral rulers, the Sforza family. Then he solidified his claim by winning the Battle of Marciano that same year. He was 1 year into his kingship, and already Francis had defeated the Habsburg Empire and taken a major city. Sadly, it was also only 1 year into his reign, and it was all downhill from here. The victory in the end proved Pyrrhic. The French state simply could not maintain Italian conquests, which often proved to be nothing more than a drain on French manpower and money. Moreover, all Francis had really done was to make a lifelong enemy out of Charles V, the man that would prove to be his nemesis for his entire life. But for the moment, Francis was riding high. He allied himself with the de Medici Pope, Leo X, to give him more legitimacy in Italy. Even this success would prove short-lived. In 1519, Charles became the Holy Roman Emperor. Francis had also put his name forward, and was bitter at the result, though realistically, there was no way the German princes were ever going to elect a French king as their emperor. So, by 1521, Francis had clearly overreached. That same year, Charles recaptured Milan. By 1523, France stood alone, England having briefly thrown in with Charles. There was a failed rebellion in France, and then a failed imperial invasion that Francis was hard-pressed to beat back. After all this, he made the colossal error of pursuing the imperial troops into Italy, where he had no support and, frankly, nothing to gain. Yet, by February the 24th, 1525, the two sides had staked out a battlefield just outside the imperial Italian capital of Pavia. The battle, as we know, was an unmitigated disaster for Francis. Not only were his forces crushed, but he and his surviving nobles were all taken captive. While incarcerated in Spain, Francis became too depressed to eat. Eventually, he fell ill, dangerously ill, from an abscess in the nose. After several weeks, when it seemed certain Francis would die, he rallied and the abscess burst. Eventually, seeing no other way out, Francis agreed to sign, under duress, a treaty with Charles V. As we know, in said treaty, Francis agreed to give up his claim to Milan and a slew of other territories. He also agreed to turn over Burgundy to Charles, which was never going to happen, and to marry Charles's sister, Queen Eleanor of Portugal. Now, here's where Henry comes in. Because for the young boy, this was a disaster. He, alongside his older brother Francois, were to be collateral for the deal. The two boys, aged 8 and 6 when exchanged, would be held hostage in Spain until Francis fulfilled the terms of a treaty he never intended to follow. He was, I suppose from one perspective at least, sacrificing the freedom of his sons for his own. On the day of the exchange, a tearful Henry received scant comfort from anyone in the entourage, except one person, a person who is going to become a central figure in his life. Her name was Diane de Poitiers. Then, 25 years old, Diane kissed the boy on the cheek before he sailed across the river, dividing the French and imperial forces. As I mentioned, and we'll come back to her, but later on, Diane will become a central figure in Henry's court. At first, the two boys were held in, quote-unquote, honorable captivity. But that changed once Charles realized Francis had no intention of following through on the agreement. Now it was Charles who was in the tough spot. Not only did he not get Burgundy, but he was totally out of money to pay his troops. On top of it all, his German territories were so torn apart by the Reformation that they could hardly defend themselves against an impending Turkish invasion. Francis did his best to make life miserable for his enemy. In 1526, he formed the League of Cognac to resist imperial hegemony. So it was that in 1527, the two captive princes were moved to Palencia, where it quickly became clear they were to be held as common prisoners with no royal privileges. Their attendants were removed and later sold as galley slaves in Tunis, where, ironically, Charles himself would later liberate them when he captured the city in 1535. Finally, something had to give. Though they hated each other with the passion of 1,000 suns, Charles and Francis were both bankrupt and exhausted. They needed peace. Both needed a resolution. In August of 1529, the two sides agreed to a new treaty. This time, the princes would be exchanged not for Burgundy, but cold, hard cash. 2 million écus. After a slew of difficulties and postponements, at last the time arrived for Henry and Francois the Dauphin to be exchanged for the gold. One of the principal difficulties to the transfer had been Francis's problem in actually raising the money. Extravagant promises to contribute to the ransom had been made by Francis's richer subjects, though when the time came, they only begrudgingly produced the money after a lot of prodding. After all, Francis's various blunders had been very expensive for the Kingdom of France. When the correct amount of écus had finally been collected, inspected, and weighed, it was discovered that unscrupulous officials had actually clipped some of the coinage. So Francis had to go back and ask for more money. Eventually, the gold was ready, and once again a strict protocol agreed, noting all the details as to how the exchange should take place. The king charged the Grand Master of France and renowned soldier Anet, Baron de Montmorency, also an important character here, with the safety of the gold and exchange of the prisoners. The Constable of Castile brought the two princes to the Bidosa River, accompanied by the emperor's sister Eleanor, who, again, was supposed to marry Francis. The exchange, which had originally been fixed for March 1530, was now to begin on the 1st of July, about a year actually after the peace treaty had been signed. Now, there were still problems. The day before the transfer, the Constable of Castile accused Montmorency and the French of a slight to his honor over some stupid little trifle. Without a full apology from the French government, the constable declared that the arrangements for the exchange would be halted. For months, Montmorency had been painstakingly fulfilling even the most petty obligations laid down in the agreement. And now, some self-important Spanish idiot threatened to prolong this business indefinitely. Clearly exasperated, Montmorency offered to give satisfaction in person. Fortunately, his reputation as a fierce soldier had the Spaniard offering to set aside his grievances with sudden grace. All was finally set for the following day. Just before the prisoners left his care, the Constable of Castile presented Henry and his brother with a pair of horses each, asking them to forgive any wrongs that he might have done them. The Dauphin appeared good-natured, but Henry, and this is going to be interesting when we talk about his personality, merely turned his back on this despised fool and farted. Queen Eleanor and the two boys finally reached France late in the evening on July the 1st, and reached Francis and his court 2 days later. Henry was now 11 years old and had been a prisoner in Spain for about 4.5 years. At first sight, the boys looked good and had obviously grown a lot, though it was soon obvious that both had been deeply scarred by their ordeal. Quiet and reserved, their insistence on points of etiquette, their clothes, and other details made them seem more Spanish than French. Henry, who had once been described as a lively, intelligent boy, had changed. He was now withdrawn, taciturn, and very quiet. Their incarceration and all the deprivations they had gone through had clearly marked both children for life. After the celebrations were over, Francis, and this just drives me bonkers, but became a little impatient with his sons for being so sad, when he exchanged them for 4 years of their freedom. He declared, quote, "The mark of a Frenchman was to be always gay and lively, and there was no time for dreamy, sully, sleepy children," end quote. Are you kidding me, buddy? To this, the king now tacitously showed a marked preference for the prince's younger brother, Charles, the Duke of Angoulême, the guy who wasn't exchanged. Younger than Henry by 1 year, Charles resembled his father in looks and outgoing manner. Henry decided to vent his frustration mostly through sport. He was constantly hunting, tilting, so jousting, wrestling, and engaging in any kind of rough exercise. I wouldn't want to be his opponent. He also became an accomplished tennis player and surrounded himself with a tight-knit band of friends. Most of these were noble youths who would one day go on to form the core of Henry's court. Around this time, Henry also developed a close bond with one of the most important French generals of the age, the aforementioned Anne de Montmorency. Henry greatly respected the old warrior. Montmorency was a staunch conservative, and Henry loved his loathing of the emperor, which he shared for obvious reasons. That fall, Francis and his family embarked on a grand tour of the kingdom. In part, this was intended as a gigantic celebration to thank his loyal subjects who contributed to freeing his son, the future kings of France. Unfortunately for France, these and Francis's later festivities were both extremely creative and extremely expensive. It was around this time that Francis started to think more about his second son, Henry, specifically his marriage prospects. After Henry VIII turned him down when Francis proposed a match to Mary Tudor, Francis approached Pope Clement about the potential for a different match. This one to a certain Catherine de Medici. Francis thought of this as nothing more than a way to get back into Italy. Little did he know just how important this marriage was going to be for the future of France. So before we move on to the wedding and Francis's death, let's sidetrack once more and introduce the woman who is going to become the first true ruling Queen of France. Catherine de Medici was born on April the 11th, 1519. Her father was Lorenzo de Medici, one of a long line of ruling de Medicis of Florence. Florence and the surrounding countrysides were their domains. Catherine's mother, a French royal herself, died shortly after the young girl's birth. Still, the fact that Catherine's mother had a blood connection to Francis I meant that she herself had a natural connection to the French royal line. This would prove important later on. Now, the Medici family itself wasn't blue-blooded in the least. They were bankers by trade, and very good ones at that. By the early 15th century, they had become the most important and wealthiest family in Florence. Lorenzo had 3 sons. It is said that he called one good, one wise, and one the fool. Unfortunately, it was the fool, Piero, who was the eldest. Ill-suited to rule, Piero found himself and his family quickly ejected from the Republic, and he later died in exile. His brother, Giuliano, the good, worked with Giovanni, the wise, who became a cardinal at 13, thanks to his father's intervention. These 2 younger of the de Medici family worked for the eventual return of the family to Florence. Unfortunately, they had to plot in bankruptcy because their fortune had been taken by usurpers and their properties confiscated by the Republic. Giovanni had a good head for intrigue, but required patience. It was a long wait before the Medici finally gained favor in Florence again. Perhaps the family motto, Le tempus reverent, our time will return, gave them courage. It was certainly the moral by which Catherine was to later live her life. In 1512, a league of small Italian states managed to temporarily expel the French from Italy. Unwisely for one of the local military leaders, he had denied the League Florentine support. The League turned upon Florence in revenge for not joining them against the French, and caused the local government to collapse. Finally, the Medicis were able to seize this moment and maneuver to regain their lost citizenship as a new regime took power. It is worth remembering that another figure returned to Florence as a result of this coup. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli. In 1513, Machiavelli, in exile at the time, wrote his famous work, The Prince. It took some time for the book to surface and make an impact outside of Florence, but eventually it would. Catherine absolutely adored the book, so much so that later contemporaries called it her Bible. We'll revisit why in later episodes. In March of 1513, Giovanni the Wise de Medici was elected Pope Leo X. At that time, Leo was the head of the family, and due to his removal to Rome, he needed to select a successor to protect the family's position in Florence. It was decided that Giuliano the Good, whom Leo thought far too soft, should help the new pope in Rome, and that their nephew Lorenzo could be left in charge of Florentine affairs, though he had no patience for them and was often in Rome with his uncle, leaving the Florentines to often feel like a colonial state. This was hardly in the tradition of even the nominal Florentine Republic, but thanks to a Medici wearing the papal crown, Leo wisely made it seem that there would be plenty of advantages for their subjugation. In 1515, Giuliano traveled as Leo's emissary to France to congratulate Francis I on his ascension to the throne. As we know, the king was in a hurry to conquer Milan and take Naples, of which the Pope was technically in charge. The 2 men met later that same year in the papal town of Bologna, where they signed an agreement that restored relations between the French Church and the papacy. To flatter Leo, Francis offered Giuliano the dukedom of Nemours in France, and his aunt, Filberta of Savoy's hand in marriage. In exchange, Francis was to get the Italian states of Parma and Pienza, and the support of the Pope regarding his ambitions for Milan and Naples. The marital alliance between the ruling house of France and the merchant Medici was as thrilling to the latter as it was to prove short-lived. Giuliano, the newly minted Duke of Nemours, died within a year of his marriage, leaving no legitimate son whatsoever. As a result, all of Leo's hopes now rested with his nephew, Lorenzo. Leo and Francis both wanted to continue this alliance, despite Giuliano's death. So Lorenzo, by then the Duke of Urbino, became His Holiness's emissary representing the Pope at the christening of Francis's firstborn son, the Dauphin. Leo had been asked to stand godfather to the baby. Sometime before the christening, Francis had written to Lorenzo to congratulate him on becoming Duke of Urbino, adding, quote, "I intend to help you with all my power. I also wish to marry you off to some beautiful and good lady of noble birth of my kind, so that the love which I bear you may be grown and strengthened." End quote. Once the bride had been selected, it was decided that the marriage should take place soon after the baptism of the Dauphin. The other important matter was the bride's enormous inheritance. This young lady came with a substantial dowry which would allow the Medicis to reestablish themselves firmly in control of Florence, and it was this young lady who was also the mother to Catherine de Medici. So it was not hard to imagine the dismay of both the Pope and the King of France when both Lorenzo and Madeleine de Medici died months later, leaving only their daughter, Catherine, as the living token. To make matters worse, Catherine fell ill in August of 1519, when only 3 months old, and for several weeks her life hung in the balance. Yet she survived, and by October Leo insisted that the Duchessina, as the Florentine people called her, could be moved to Rome without risks to her health. Leo had already emphatically refused Francis's request that the child be brought up at the French court. He, quite sensibly, declined to offer up his great niece, it was really his only card left to play, as a hostage against the promises he had made to Francis. For, as we know, he was already planning to break them. The circumstances had completely changed, so now must his policies. After he wiped away his tears at the death of his nephew and niece, Leo lost no time in opening secret talks with King Charles of Spain, now Charles V, the new Holy Roman Emperor, and as we know, Francis's mortal enemy. By May of 1521, Leo was openly allied to Charles, whom he had promised to crown as emperor and invest with Naples. When he heard the news, Francis fell into a furious rage at the Pope's betrayal, and before long, France and the Empire were once more at war. Catherine was dutifully brought to Rome, but Leo didn't live long enough to see any plans for her to come to fruition. On December the 1st, 1521, he died. Catherine's life and position now very much depended on the Medicis being able to remain in power in Florence without papal assistance, which would be a difficult task. The new pope, Hadrian VI, Adrian of Utrecht, and Charles V's boyhood tutor, was no friend to the de Medicis. Luckily for Catherine, Hadrian died in September of 1523. By the way, just as a side note here, from this point on, it would be 450 years until the next non-Italian would be elected pope. In Hadrian's place, Giuliano de Medici became Pope Clement VII. Once more, Catherine looked like a potentially good marriage pawn. Clement left for Rome and left his lieutenant Cardinal Passarini in charge of Florence. But Clement ruled Florence and everyone knew it and resented it. Clement was not the man for the hour, as we know. Charles and Francis were nearly always at war or on the verge of war. Lutheranism kept expanding in Germany, and Clement seemed powerless to do anything about it. As a result, Italy plunged ever deeper into chaos. Disaster struck on May the 6th, 1527, when imperial troops camped outside Rome ran amok and pillaged the city. As Rome was sacked, an insurrection was mounted in Florence. Aided by the arrival of the emperor's army, the overthrow of Passarini and the Medician regime proved all too easy. Catherine's position now was uncertain. By the 11th of May, 1527, News had filtered back to Florence about the horrors taking place in Rome. In the Medici palace, the 8-year-old Catherine would have grasped that this was a calamity. Passerini and his sons fled Florence on the 17th of May. This left Catherine and her aunt alone to face the wrath of the mob. The new rulers of Florence boiled with fury and refused to let Catherine out of their grasp. It was then decided that the child should be taken to the Santa Lucia convent, a place known for its antipathy to the Medici family. Moments later, Catherine found herself being bundled off for what would prove to be 3 hazardous years of semi-incarceration, during which her life was under different degrees of threat, depending upon what was going on in the political scene. The little girl lived miserably in the Santa Lucia convent, but in December 1527, orders came that she be moved to the convent of Santa Caterina in Siena, also in Florence. When the French ambassador visited her, he found the place a disease-ridden hovel and insisted that Catherine must be relocated immediately. With the permission of the Florentine Signoria, the ambassador arranged for the child's transfer to a far nicer location. Another convent, this one, the Santa Maria. The convent of Santa Maria in this case was actually known more as a fortress than as a convent, its walls being so high. These walls deprived Catherine of her liberty, but they also protected her from the hostile world outside. Hatred now fueled the Florentine people's mood as they desecrated and damaged all reminders of the Medici. During an angry outburst early in this rebellion, Michelangelo's masterpiece, the Statue of David, lost its left arm when a stone was thrown at it. If Catherine were to remain a valuable negotiating tool for the government in Florence, however, they had to see to her well-being. Now, as luck would have it, the abbess of the Santa Maria convent was Catherine's godmother, and she arranged for her to have a spacious and comfortable cell. During this period of her life, Catherine was forced to develop the skills that would later make her a formidable politician. Listening, empathy, conversation, and the fortitude to keep her own counsel. One of the nuns wrote of the child as, quote, "Dear little child with such gracious manners that she made herself loved by all. She was so gentle and pleasant that the sisters did all they could to ease her sorrows and difficulties," end quote. Another wrote of the girl's, quote, "good disposition," end quote. They felt protective of Catherine. While death continued to take all of Catherine's loved ones, her mother figure dying on May the 3rd, 1528, the French ambassador now became her only rock in the storm, and he did what he could to see to her well-being. In October 1529, imperial troops laid siege to the city of Florence. The accompanying plague and famine only exacerbated the people's hatred of the Medici, who they now associated with the Pope, who everyone blamed, rightly or wrongly, for Italy's present dilemma. Within the city, the leaders began to wonder whether they might use Catherine as a means of escaping their present catastrophe. The Signora sent a contingent of troops to fetch her late in the evening on July the 20th, 1530. Catherine, certain that she had been condemned to death, and that they had come to fetch her for her execution, put up a struggle. In preparation, the 11-year-old girl had cut her hair and donned a nun's habit. Announcing that as a bride of Christ, she refused to go quietly, Catherine cried out, quote, "Holy Mother, I am yours. Let us now see what excommunicated wretch will dare to drag a spouse of Christ from her monastery," end quote. She refused to change out of her nun's clothing, and the men gathered to take her brought her through the small streets riding a donkey, braving a starving and menacing crowd, voicing threats and open hatred. This perilous journey proved to be a formative experience for the young woman, as the men kept Catherine safe and surrounded until she was delivered to the Santa Lucia convent. It was actually here that she had first started life as a captive nearly 3 years earlier. She actually never forgot the kindness of the guards who protected her. And when on the 12th of August 1530 the siege was lifted and Pope Clement took possession of the city once more, she interceded for these men and succeeded in having their death sentences commuted to exile. Upon her release, Catherine visited the sisters of the other convent she had stayed in, and together they celebrated her good fortune. She remained in contact with these orders for the rest of her life and wrote to them regularly, sending them money annually and giving them revenues from one of her properties. This was one of Catherine's most important personality traits. She never forgot a kindness and never forgave a disservice. Now, all the too soon, this young girl found herself a central feature in Pope Clement's international policy and was moved to Rome. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly how Catherine passed her time in Rome. Certainly, her later love of architecture might be connected to this period. In Rome, she also would have become accustomed to the formalities of the papal court, and she would lean on that experience in later years. Family matters were at the top of Pope Clement's agenda. His illegitimate son in 1532 was created the new Duke of Florence. Catherine had been sent to the city to lend legitimacy to the proceedings, and for the first time, she undertook public duties. Observers noted that the now 13-year-old Catherine carried herself with admirable dignity and grace. She continued her public role in Florence while awaiting the arrival of Pope Clement's son's bride in April of 1533. Apart from enjoying the many and lavish celebrations marking the new duke's confirmation, Catherine also continued to pursue her studies. We know little about her formal education, but we do know that she learned Greek, Latin, and French. She was also a keen mathematician, an interest that would coincide later with her love of astrology. Clement kept her in Florence while he proceeded carefully with marriage talks on her behalf in Rome. Now, since her birth, Catherine had inevitably been the object of much matrimonial discussion. Even before the revolt in Florence, Clement had been approached by various potential suitors, mainly various Italian nobles, from families such as the Gonzaga of Mantua, the Este of Ferrara, and the della Rovere of Urbino. Now that the Pope enjoyed a far stronger position than formerly, he looked for more illustrious offers. Among the earlier candidates was Henry VIII's illegitimate son, the Duke of Richmond. Although Sir John Russell, the English ambassador to the Vatican, reported His Holiness was, quote, very well contented to have such an alliance, end quote, nothing came of the talks, and the Duke died a few years later, probably from being poisoned. When the Duke of Albany, Catherine's uncle, proposed the candidacy of James V of Scotland, Clement did not think this offered him any real advantages, and worried that the courier service between the two countries would be too costly. The Prince of Orange had briefly been considered a possible husband, until he died while trying to retake Florence. The one candidate Clement could not afford to ignore, however, was the Holy Roman Emperor's own preference. Charles backed a marriage between Catherine and Francisco II, Sforza, Duke of Milan. Unfortunately for Catherine, the Duke was not exactly intelligent. He was prematurely aged at 37, he was sickly, and mainly by the huge sums of the money demanded by the emperor in order to retain his duchy, was not particularly gleaming prospect for anyone. In addition, Clement feared that by marrying Catherine to Charles's client, he would find himself so deeply in the emperor's pocket that he would never be able to free himself. Another worry for Clement, of course, was Charles' request for a general church council. He didn't want the potential schism this would bring, but remember from previous episodes, Clement wasn't good at dealing with the ongoing Reformation. He did his best to try to put his head in the sand and ignore it. Interestingly, though, there was a reason for this. Clement had never actually been ordained into the priesthood, and so he was technically not eligible to be pope. And he feared that if he called a church council, it might result in his removal, which makes sense. But then something happened. A new proposal, a really exciting proposal, arrived for Catherine's marriage. And this one came from Francis I, of course, of France. His ambitions for territories in Italy were stirring again, and he needed a friendly pope to back him. In 1531, with this in mind, Francis offered Clement his second son, Henry, Duke of Orleans, as a potential husband for Catherine. Early in 1531, the Bishop of Tarbes was sent as Francis's envoy to discuss such a marriage. By April already, a preliminary agreement had been signed by Francis. It is stipulated that Catherine would live at the French court until the age to consummate the marriage, and secret clauses in the agreement stated that her dowry would include Pisa, Parma, Pienza, Reggio, Modena, and Leghorn. Clement also committed himself to backing French efforts to take Genoa and Milan, and to make a joint effort to annex Urbino for the young couple. In June 1531, word came back to France that Clement would not, after all, send Catherine to live at the French court before her marriage. He was both wary of the wrath he knew this alliance would incur in the emperor, and fearful of any change in French policy once Catherine found herself in Francis's hands. His matrimonial ace would thus remain in his own care until the wedding. Clement also stipulated that Catherine's dowry of 100,000 gold écus would include an extra 30,000 écus in exchange for the revenues from her Florentine inheritance. Francis agreed to give Catherine a further 10,000 livres per annum, and she would enjoy a substantial income that came from her mother's inheritance. Now, as the second son of the King of France, Henry, Duke of Orleans, had no shortage of potential brides. The most important of these had been Mary Tudor. The possibility of a marriage with Henry VIII's eldest daughter had been marred, though, when the English king tried to have the marriage to her mother, Catherine of Aragon, annulled. Meanwhile, Francis concentrated his efforts on Catherine, who could best further his Italian ambitions. Henry, who as the second son could not be expected to inherit the French throne, represented a substantial catch for any royal princess, let alone an Italian duchess without a duchy. Catherine might have been rich, but she was emphatically not of royal blood. In January 1533 at Bologna, secret talks were held between Clement and Francis's emissaries. The Pope, terrified that the emperor would put a stop to the French alliance if he caught wind of it, decided to continue negotiations regarding a marriage to Francisco, Duke of Milan, as a feint. In fact, Charles, certain that Francis would never stoop to marrying his son to a merchant's daughter, generally laughed off the rumors when he heard about them. By the time the marriage was announced later on that same month, Charles V could do nothing about it, other than be amazed. It was really Pope Clement's finest hour. The marriage was set for the summer of 1533 at Nice. The jewelry that Catherine brought with her alone was worth a kingdom. One piece was a set of pearls which she would later gift to Mary, Queen of Scots. Queen Elizabeth of England would wear them after Mary lost the neck necessary for wearing such an item. Catherine's first meeting with Henry, it should go without saying, I hope that the marriage was arranged, went fine. This despite the fact that Henry was taciturn and awkward. He was tall and muscular and not bad looking, but he was somewhat melancholy. Francis managed to push him into at least appearing to enjoy his own wedding. The nuptial mass finally took place on October the 28th, 1533, and the event went off without a hitch. By midwinter, Catherine and the royal women had joined the king and his entourage in Burgundy, where Francis immediately announced the details of the agreement he had made with Pope Clement. First, he proclaimed the Duchy of Urbino to be the rightful territory of his son Henry through his marriage to Catherine. And by the July of 1534, he was building an army ready to reconquer Urbino. Milan and other Italian territories would now be added as well, with the help of his papal ally. Meanwhile, Catherine spent little time with her husband and more time with his sisters, Marguerite and Madeleine, whose household she shared. Traveling back through France to Paris with her father-in-law's huge itinerant court, Catherine, amiable and eager to please, made great efforts to be liked. Gradually, she became part of her new family and won over some of her more snobbish courtiers, though there were those among them who muttered that they would rather have their knees broken than bend them to an Italian merchant's daughter. Then, disaster struck. On the 25th of September, 1534, less than a year after Catherine's marriage, Pope Clement VII died in Rome. His territorial promises to Francis unfulfilled, and Catherine's dowry only partially paid. Francis was apoplectic, and the French people soon decried this union as ridiculous, a fool's bargain. The child who thought that she had found a family, peace, and security was left to reap the harvest of her uncle's untimely death. The new Pope, Alexandre Farnese, who took the title of Pope Paul III, was neutral but firmly refused to honor either Clement's dowry obligations or the alliance with Francis. Catherine was now of no value whatsoever to Francis politically, and he declared, quote, "The girl has come to me stark naked," end quote. In contrast to her triumphant arrival in France, Catherine now faced 1,000 pinpricks of humiliation as her prestige vanished with the wind, along with Clement's worthless promises. As always, if you'd enjoyed the show, please check out the links in the show notes. Got additional content there. You can support the show for $1 a month, $12 a year. Makes a big difference over here for us. In addition, if you're not financially able, please give us a rating, a review. It helps us attract new listeners and acolytes to the wonders that is Western history.